In 1985, Dr. Anton Mood, a pediatrician from Malta, received an urgent call from his contractor. The contractor was clearing land for a new medical clinic, and Dr. Mood hoped they didn't need more equipment, as they were on the remote island of Gozo, part of Malta. The nearest mainland, Italy, was 60 miles away by boat. But it quickly became clear that the call wasn't about equipment. The contractor sounded panicked, even fearful, and Dr. Mood wondered if someone had been injured. After calming him down, the contractor explained what had happened. While digging, the workers had uncovered human bones. Dr. Mood suggested calling the police, but the contractor revealed something more disturbing. The skeleton was 10 feet long. The doctor immediately dismissed it as impossible. No human could have been that enormous. But then he recalled a local legend. Many thousands of years ago, on a late winter night in Malta, a farmer was roused from sleep by an odd rumbling sound. It didn't seem like wind, but something deeper. His family was still asleep, and he decided to investigate before alarming them. Stepping out of his hut and into his wheat field, he was puzzled. It should have been pitch dark, as it was just a day or two after the new moon, but instead an eerie orange glow bathed the field, growing brighter by the second. The sound grew louder, too. The farmer had seen meteors before, small and scattered across the sky, but this was something different. This was a single large object, blazing a path through the night sky. As it neared, fear struck him. The fiery object was growing in size, and it appeared to be heading directly for the island. He wanted to warn his family, but there wasn't time. In an instant, the object streaked past, leaving a trail of fire in the sky above his hut, across the field, and into a nearby valley. A bright flash lit up the island and the sea beyond. Then just as quickly, everything fell back into darkness. The farmer's wife came outside, alarmed. He tried to comfort her, but she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at something behind him, toward the direction of the crash. The farmer turned around and saw a massive figure emerge from the woods, taller than the trees. The giant known as SSA had arrived. When SSA emerged on Gozo, the locals were terrified. However, despite her towering size and strength, she eventually won their trust. SSA claimed to be part of a race known as the Nephilim and promised to protect the islanders. For centuries, the farmers had been at constant risk from raiders and pirates, but with the arrival of this giant, they now had a powerful guardian. The island was rich with enormous limestone blocks, some weighing 20 tons and standing 20 feet high. To the Maltese people, these stones were too massive to be useful, as they lacked metal tools and the wheel at that time. But SSA had no such limitations. She could effortlessly lift the heaviest stones and carefully position them one by one. Soon, massive temples were constructed, some reaching 3 stories high. She built 30 different megalithic temples across the islands, with the most impressive one located on the island of Gozo. The locals called it Gigantia, meaning giant in Maltese. Gigantia consists of 2 separate buildings, constructed from enormous limestone blocks, and it still stands today. Over time, Sense's story faded into local legend, becoming a myth. People stopped believing that such massive stone blocks could be moved by a giant. That was until the bones were found. The Maltese Islands have been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, and their location is strategically significant. Situated just 60 miles from Italy and 180 miles from North Africa, they lie in the heart of the Mediterranean Sea. The Phoenicians were the first to claim Malta, followed by the Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, and Christians. In 1530, Malta was governed by John Abela, a nobleman who became the first in a long time to show interest in the temples on the islands. He began collecting artifacts and documenting ancient structures. Many of these temples had been buried under layers of debris due to centuries of neglect, but a bit of digging revealed their massive scale. Abela couldn't fathom how ancient farmers could have built these colossal temples. Then one day a worker found something lodged in a rock fissure. When Abela saw it, the answer to the mystery seemed clear. These temples were built by a giant. The worker handed him a femur, the largest bone in the human leg, but this femur was far larger than a human's. It was twice the size of an average human femur, and someone with such a bone would have to be about 10 feet tall. Abela then had workers search the island, and by 1647 he had gathered enough bones to publish a groundbreaking book that earned him fame. He became known as the father of Maltese history. The book documented skull fragments, giant femurs and tibias, enormous vertebrae, and massive pelvic bones. Abela concluded that the Maltese temples were constructed by a prehistoric race of giants who once lived on the island. He converted his home into Malta's first museum, displaying the bones and opening it to the public. Anatomists and naturalists who viewed the large bones agreed that they must have belonged to giants. Skeptics, however, suggested they were animal bones and argued that without fully clearing the sites, the truth couldn't be known for certain. Decades later, proper archaeological excavations were conducted, but what was uncovered only deepened the mystery. In 1915, a Maltese farmer contacted the Malta Museum director, Sir Tommy Zamet, after repeatedly striking large stone blocks while plowing his field, expecting to find more temple remains. Instead, Zamet discovered something entirely unexpected: a massive statue. The top of the statue was damaged, but the bottom remained intact, 2 giant legs and feet. The statue stood over 10 feet tall. As the workers continued digging, what had initially appeared to be a buried statue turned out to be part of something much larger. The statue was situated in the center of a vast complex of megalithic temples. Zamet uncovered one of Malta's most significant and impressive archaeological sites, the Tarxian Temples, a group of 4 structures arranged in a cloverleaf pattern, visible only from above. The temples were made of limestone blocks, some reaching 20 feet in height and weighing over 50 tons. Walls, doorways, and even floors were constructed using these enormous stones, all perfectly fitted together. Zamet continued his work, overseeing the excavation of nearly 30 megalithic sites, all built with massive limestone slabs. The question that constantly troubled Zamet was, how could Stone Age farmers on such a remote island have built these structures? The temple discovered at Hagar-Kim is even more puzzling. It might be the oldest calendar in the world. On the equinoxes, the sun aligns with the temple's main axis, and on the solstices, it aligns with the opposite axis. The alignment is almost perfect. Now, it might seem strange that a culture capable of constructing such a precise site would be off by a few degrees. So, what went wrong? Well, nothing at all. The Earth slowly wobbles on its axis, which causes the position of the stars to shift over time, a phenomenon called precession. There was a time when the temple at Hagar-Kim was perfectly aligned with these celestial events, around 10,200 BC. That places it right after the Younger Dryas, when the ice sheets melted and a massive flood swept across the Earth. The flood was sudden and devastating. Coastal cities were obliterated, washed away by a mile-high tsunami traveling at the speed of sound. The remains of these cities now lie at the bottom of the sea. The only humans to survive were those on higher ground. The entire planet's landscape was altered. The cause of this flood is still debated. Some suggest it was caused by the impact of a giant asteroid, while others think it was triggered by a massive solar event. Zamet, however, was exploring Hagar-Kim in the early 1900s. He didn't know about asteroids or solar storms, but he did know the story of the Great Flood. In his time, the flood was seen as God's wrath to destroy the Nephilim. It was meant to wipe out the giants. The Nephilim are mentioned in the book of Genesis as powerful warriors of great size and strength. While the Bible doesn't go into much detail, other holy texts offer more information. The Book of Enoch, excluded from most versions of the Bible, is significant, especially in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and among scholars of early Judaism and Christianity. The Book of Enoch tells the story of the origins of evil. It begins with a group of angels called the Watchers. God assigned them to watch over humanity, but they eventually rebelled. They took human wives, which was forbidden, and were cast out of heaven to live in the underworld. But their evil influence remained on earth. The Watchers and their human wives had offspring, mighty giants called the Nephilim. According to the Book of Enoch, these giants caused destruction on earth, which led to God sending the flood to wipe them out. The Nephilim, if they were destroyed in the flood, would have been long gone before the early Maltese farmers arrived on the island. However, in the Book of Numbers, there's a continuation of the story. Moses sent spies to explore the land of Canaan, and they reported seeing giants who may have survived the flood. The land we explored devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, and we felt like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. The Maltese legend of Hagar Chim dates back thousands of years before the Bible was written, but it perfectly aligns with the story in the Book of Enoch. According to legend, Sununa, a demigod and giant who survived the flood, was stranded on the island. She likely sought to continue her species, and with no other giants on the island, she might have taken a human mate. That could explain the discovery of the skulls. In 1902, as the British Navy expanded its base in Malta and new housing developments began, workers were digging a site for a large water tank when the ground suddenly collapsed, revealing a massive underground chamber. Excavations revealed a labyrinth of rooms and burial chambers. Zamet named the site the Hypogeum, the Greek word for underground. What Zamet discovered mirrored the megalithic temples above ground. There were limestone walls and doorways, the same slate floors, and precise, massive stonework. Zamet and his team were astonished by the size of this underground world. Then they realized this was just the first level. 2 more levels were beneath it, perhaps more. The Hypogeum was filled with well-preserved artifacts, and the most common design found was the figure of a giant, the same design seen throughout the island. Many sections of the Hypogeum were used as burial grounds, which naturally meant there would be bones. Zamet discovered the remains of over 7,000 individuals, some dating back to the Neolithic period. He meticulously documented every bone he encountered until he came across a group of 12 skulls that puzzled him. These skulls were elongated, resembling what you might expect from an alien. While they did appear that way, Zamet knew that many cultures used head binding to intentionally elongate skulls. So he had scientists examine them, and they confirmed the craniums were naturally elongated, not the result of binding. But the strangeness didn't stop there. Every human skull has a seam between the 2 parietal bones called the sagittal suture. This seam is there because our skulls are flexible when we're born, making it easier for our large heads to pass through the birth canal. Over time, these bones fuse, forming that distinctive seam, but these elongated skulls had no seam at all. That's impossible. This seam is vital for normal human development. So, were these skulls even human? They didn't appear to be, at least not entirely human. In 1920, National Geographic reported that the original inhabitants of Malta were an alien race with these elongated skulls. Zamet would have dismissed that claim as absurd, but he couldn't explain the skulls otherwise. Then he remembered the legend of Sununa. Part of the Sununa story tells of her carrying stones under one arm and cradling a baby in the other, the child being a human Nephilim hybrid. Let's revisit the skulls for a moment. For a child to be born with a fully developed skull, it would have to travel through an unusually large birth canal, one that would belong to a giant. Perhaps these skulls belong to the descendants of Sununa. If they were human, Nephilim hybrids, they might have had the size and strength to construct and carve the Hypogeum. It's a fascinating theory that adds depth to the legend, but it remains speculative. There's no solid evidence of giants living underground in the Hypogeum, at least not until 1940 when someone witnessed them. In August 1940, National Geographic published a chilling and unusual story about the Hypogeum. The article revealed that excavators had uncovered the remains of over 33,000 individuals sacrificed by an ancient pagan cult. The report also included a disturbing account of a school field trip. A group of children visited the Hypogeum, a site known for the sacrifices of thousands, and they went into the underground cave, never to return. 30 children and their teacher entered a passageway and vanished. Some speculated they had gotten lost or trapped behind a cave-in, but they were never seen again. For weeks, parents reported hearing wailing and screams from the depths below, yet numerous excavations and search efforts turned up no trace of the missing group. After 3 weeks, the authorities declared them dead. To this day, the children's remains have never been found, which leads us to the story of Lois. Lois Jessup was visiting Malta with a few friends to explore historical sites. On a hot summer afternoon, locals recommended a visit to the Hypogeum. It was not only an incredible historical site, but also underground, offering a welcome respite from the Mediterranean heat. They found the entrance and hired a guide named Joe to show them around. As they navigated through various passageways, they reached an intriguing cave entrance adorned with ancient carvings and red ochre paintings. The entrance was damp and musty, but once they stepped inside, the air was dry and clean. Joe explained that there were 3 floors of underground rooms, and he handed Lois and each of her friends a lit candle. One by one, they entered the cave, walking single file through a narrow passage. They emerged into a large room with smooth limestone walls. As they talked and laughed, their voices echoed, creating a strange humming sound. Joe informed them that the room had been built millennia ago for a powerful oracle who could perform miracles using certain sounds. He mentioned that the room would still work today, should anyone know the correct sound. Lois and her friends followed Joe down another narrow passage, this time going much deeper into the Hypogeum, heading into its lowest depths. Lois couldn't tell exactly how far they had descended, but her instincts told her it was at least 20 or 30 feet. The tunnel opened into another spacious chamber with shelves carved into the walls. At first, Lois thought they might be beds or resting areas, but upon closer inspection, they were shaped like coffins. Joe explained that this was where they buried their dead. He pointed to a slit in the wall, and Lois noticed several more slits spaced evenly around the room. She peered through one and saw skeletons. Lois asked about them, and Joe replied that they were prisoners whose remains could not be disturbed. After a brief look around, Joe announced, "This is the end of the tour. Time to go back." But Lois had one more question. She pointed to a small, narrow doorway about 3 feet wide and asked, "What's down there?" Joe replied, "If you go in, you go at your own risk, and you won't get far." Lois, feeling challenged, tied a rope around her waist and passed it to her friends, each of them doing the same. Lois and her 3 companions squeezed through the small opening. The 4 women ventured into the dark passage, leaving the other 2 behind with Joe. Though it was dark, they still had their candles, and the adventure was exactly what they were hoping for. After a while, the passage widened enough for Lois to stand, but as soon as she stood up, she began to lean forward and felt herself starting to fall. A rush of cold air hit her face, and she was abruptly yanked back. Luckily, the rope had held. Lois was now standing on a ledge no wider than 2 feet, with a sheer drop of about 50 feet below. From behind her, a friend urged her to keep moving, claiming they were feeling claustrophobic in the tunnel, but Lois was paralyzed in place. Here's what she saw. There, across the cave, from an opening deep below me, emerged 20 giant figures. They walked in single file along a narrow ledge. Their height, I judged, to be about 25 feet, since their heads reached halfway up the opposite wall. They moved slowly, taking long strides. Then they all stopped, turned, and raised their heads in my direction. In unison, they raised their arms and beckoned me with their hands. Terror rooted me to the spot. Another gust of wind rushed up from the cavern, blowing out my candle, and everything went black. In a panic, Lois began screaming. She shouted, "Go back, go back!" while pushing her friends back the way they had come. The women tumbled back into the room where Joe and the others were waiting. Joe said nothing, but Lois couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I looked up at him and our eyes met. I knew that at one point he had seen what I'd seen. There was a look of caution in his eyes, which only made me more hesitant to tell anyone. I decided not to. Lois turned to leave when Joe grabbed her arm. He said, If you're interested in exploring more, you should join a group soon. I'll be taking a teacher and her students down there. I'm sure they'd enjoy the company. I left my contact info with him and asked him to have the teacher reach out, but I never heard anything more until one of my friends told me to read the paper. Months later, Lois returned to the hypogeum and found another guide. She inquired about the teacher and the children, but the guide simply shrugged, saying he couldn't talk about it. Lois pressed on, asking, "Where's Joe?" The guide, now a man, replied, "Ma'am, I've been the guide here for years. I don't know anyone named Joe." Lois opened her mouth to respond, but was struck by an unsettling feeling, so she left. Though the hypogeum had once been her favorite place to visit, she never returned to Malta again, not once. Malta is filled with stories of giants riding comets, building massive temples, and creating underground cities. Some say they were descendants of the Nephilim, capturing any humans who wander too far. There are also tales of elongated skulls, looking more alien than human. How much of this is true? Quite a bit, but not everything. The temples on Malta and Gozo remain a mystery. No one is certain who constructed these structures or why they remain some of the oldest freestanding buildings in the world. For years, mainstream archaeology claimed these temples couldn't be older than 2600 BC, during the Bronze Age. However, carbon dating has shown they are at least 1,000 years older than that, a proven fact. While there's no physical evidence linking them to the Younger Dryas, the theory that Hagar Kim was solar-aligned is true. If it were built between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago, the alignment would be perfect. We simply can't prove it, but for years, mainstream science got the age of these sites wrong. They were constructed at a time before humans had the technology to work stone so precisely, before the invention of the wheel and writing, yet they exist. Building these structures would have required very advanced engineering and logistics, and no one has yet explained how this was achieved. Regarding the giant bones discovered by Abela in the 1600s turned out to be from elephants, not giants. Above ground, there's no evidence of giants. However, things get a little more complicated underground. Let's clarify a few things. First, Zamet didn't find 7,000 skeletons, but rather about 7,000 bones in total, with around 120 individual skeletons identified. As for the 33,000 sacrifices, there's no evidence of that either, only the 120 people. The myth of missing children is just an urban legend. Locals believe it was a story parents told their children to keep them out of the hypogeum. In fact, a wall painting in the catacombs beneath St. Paul's Basilica in Rabat, Malta, depicts a group of children disappearing in the caves as a warning. Lois Jessup's story is intriguing. She was a real person who did write about her experience, and some of it has been quoted here. However, it's probably just a story. The rooms she describes don't exist in the lower levels of the hypogeum. It's possible she stumbled upon a secret level known only to giants, but there's not much lower to go before you hit water. The curators of the hypogeum suggest that if she was in a flooded chamber with a candle, the reflections may have disoriented her. That could be true, but the inclusion of the missing children in her story is what ultimately debunks it. If a group of children had gone missing in the 20th century, there would have been reports of it, but there are none. Back in 1940, National Geographic wasn't as widely read as it is today, and often featured stories of the bizarre and fantastical. I wish they would return to that. The elongated skulls are another mystery. Sir Tammy Zamet, trained as a doctor, had knowledge of anatomy and craniology. He documented the skulls as being of the long-headed type, but didn't go into much detail. These skulls were kept hidden from the public for many years, which fueled speculation, but they were finally displayed a couple of years ago. While some are indeed long-headed, at least one appears to have been artificially elongated by binding, similar to practices in various cultures. However, not all the skulls show signs of this. Skeptics might claim that the elongation is genetic, perhaps alien genetics. Or could the skulls have been elongated as a way to worship a prehistoric god? Ancient astronaut theorists might agree, but the debate continues as the skulls are still being studied. So what are your thoughts on this? Tell us in the comments below and subscribe for more content like this.